Okay. Okay. These thresholds are just too low, and they mischaracterize extreme poverty. So let's talk a bit about this. Now, first of all, in that paper, we do a replication of Edin and Shaefer, and we start in the upper left corner. You see what they would get for estimates if you use the same measure and estimation approaches as they do. In 2016, 1.6% or 5.2 million people would have been under $2 a day, and this increased 128% from 96 to 2014. But as you move along in this figure, we make a number of different corrections to how they do it. You address survey underreporting, you incorporate all the welfare transfers that people receive, maybe 50% here, or even 100% of the value of SNAP benefits, and you find that they dramatically overestimate the extent of $2 a day poverty. Instead of 1.6%, it's 0.44%. Instead of 5.2 million, it's 1.4 million, and it increased 82% rather than 128%. So amongst children, even more tellingly and quite different from Edin and Shaefer, there's been actually oops, sorry, hold on a second. Okay, amongst children, there's actually been a decline of $2 a day poverty. So in this figure, we show you the top line is the uncorrected, sort of like Edin and Shaefer's do. The bottom line is if you make all the corrections that you should make to the data. And you find actually that child poverty declined. Now you could say, well, any extreme child poverty below $2 a day is objectionable. And of course I agree, of course that's true. But by focusing on it this way, by exaggerating and mismeasuring it, we not only misunderstand the level of the problem, but we mischaracterize what the nature of extreme poverty actually is in the United States. So with a better measure of poverty, we say we should measure it at 10% of the median, which we argue is a more defensible threshold. And you can look at people with and without SNAP. And what we find that's really clear with this extreme measure of poverty is that the people that are actually extremely poor are people in childless households. That's where the extreme poverty mostly is in the United States. And you see this on the right side of your figure. And that doesn't matter how you measure it, whether you include survey underreporting, whether you include the value of SNAP benefits or not. By contrast, on the left-hand side of the figure, you can see that for the most part, we've reduced extreme child poverty by SNAP. SNAP has worked quite effectively. And so with the correct measurement, we see that extreme poverty is a problem mostly among childless households, not amongst children. Now, what's worse, even if you agree that, or even if you think that any child extreme poverty is bad, it's the case we can show you that even if you focus just on children, their measurement strategy mischaracterizes who the extreme children are that are poor. So mismeasuring extreme poverty results in a mischaracterization of who is extreme poor, even amongst kids. Amongst kids, the real group of people that is most likely to be extreme poor are children or in immigrant households. So they're children that were born outside the United States or children whose head is not a citizen. And almost, in the case of $2 a day poverty, 72% of kids that are in under $2 a day poverty live with a non-citizen head. And so it's not a story of single motherhood. It's not a story of welfare reform and the decline of aid to families with dependent children. Rather, it's a story of food stamps and who has access to food stamps and a story of immigrants. And this shows us that we just completely misunderstood the problem because of measurement. Now, as another example of this, one of the ones I like to sort of work out as a thought problem when we think about the sense that poverty is so dramatic and we should tell the stories of extreme poverty is the way we think about homelessness here in the United States. And we view homelessness as this incredibly intractable social problem. We feel it's overwhelming and we are very troubled by it, but we overrepresent the homeless in a way that gives us a false perception that this is not a tractable problem. So let's just walk through a thought experiment about this issue. So the national point in time homeless count in 2019 was about 567,000 people. And everybody agrees this is an undercount, but just to make the math easy, let's assume it was a rounded million people. Okay. And as we all know here in California, the homeless are highly visible in affluent parts of California cities. So you can live in a rich part of LA or Orange County like I do and still see homelessness. And this is different from most of the poor. Most of the poor are segregated away from us when we live in affluent communities. So it's more visible. It gives us an overrepresentation of the nature of poverty. But even with 1 million homeless people, this is only 0.25% of the US population. This is a very small population in some sense of the words. Even if you just look at those that are poor with a reasonable definition of poverty, only less than 2% of the poor are homeless. So for every homeless person that we see near our affluent neighborhoods, we should remember there's probably 50 working poor people we don't see. okay? And so homelessness is a significant problem, but it's far more smaller. And I'm gonna argue that it's actually quite manageable, all right? If, for example, we gave a $2,500 a month universal basic income to every single homeless person, and I would admit for some homeless folks, it would take more than $2,500, but for lots of other homeless folks, it would take a lot less than $2,500 to help them get out of homelessness, okay? We could still do it at $2,500. We'd save a lot of money in the other costs of homelessness that exist in terms of ambulance or policing services, but for merely $30 billion. And if you know the US government's budget, $30 billion is not a lot of money. It simply isn't. And to give you a sense of this, here are 3 tax deductions we have in the United States today that each could pay for this, okay? If we got rid of the deduction on pass-through income, that could save $35 billion. The deduction on qualified dividends could save $31 billion. The home mortgage interest tax deduction could save $25 billion. And what's remarkable about that one is that a couple years ago, the home mortgage interest tax deduction was $75 billion. And the Trump tax cuts actually did reduce this. And what I'm emphasizing with these cases, all of these tax deductions go to affluent people like myself. And by eliminating any one of these tax deductions, we would have enough money to pay for homelessness. But we politically choose not to do so. So it's not a problem that this is such an overwhelming social problem that's so hopelessly intractable. The problem is we politically choose to not have social policies to address a fixable social problem. Now, beyond that, I want to sort of emphasize as a bigger picture theme how, again, poverty, by focusing on poverty as a problem of persons, we really understand or misunderstand the systemic high poverty that exists. And one of my favorite quotes is from a poverty scholar I think is really terrific and in some ways quite underappreciated, and that's Mark Rank. And Mark Rank has written this example a couple of different times, so I'll just read it to you now. He says that picture a game with 10 players, but only 8 chairs. When the music stops, who's most likely to be left standing? It will be those who are at a disadvantage in terms of competing for the available chairs, maybe less agility, reduced speed, a bad position when the music stops, and so on. That would be an explanation that it's a problem of persons. However, given the game is structured in a way such that 2 players are bound to lose, these individual attributes only explain who loses, not why there are losers in the first place. Ultimately, there's simply not enough chairs for those playing the game. The critical mistake that's been made in the past is that we've equated the question of who loses at the game with the question of why the game inevitably produces losers. They are in fact distinct and separate questions. So now to advance that, I want to sort of summarize political theories of poverty briefly, even though most of today's talk has been about trying to demonstrate the problems of the poor rather than poverty. Okay, in political theories of poverty, what we do is we emphasize that power and institutions are the major drivers of social policies. And social policies are the principal factor that explains whether a country has systemically high or systemically low poverty. Now, more to the point, policies moderate the relationship between behaviors and poverty. We make choices politically about which risk groups we're going to take care of and which ones we're not. And we've made a choice in the United States to not moderate the relationship between single motherhood and child poverty. And that's why it's so strongly associated with child poverty. But more to the point, we would say that institutions also directly influence poverty and moderate behavior. Now, remember earlier on, I said that, in the dramatization of poverty, that literature, the tendency is to go find the most extreme case of poverty you can and to dramatize that example. Now, I would argue instead of going to the ghetto to study the lived experiences of the extreme poor, which is still worth doing, but we also need to go to the state legislature to study the policymakers who have power over the poor. And we don't do enough of this in poverty research. Now, I'll give you one example of this. I'm going to feature the work I'm doing with Tom Van Hevelen on unionization and poverty. And I'm doing this partly because this study only looks at the United States, because one of the criticisms of political theories of poverty is to sort of dismiss it as only working in Sweden. It's like only in Sweden does that work. And I want to show you here in the United States, you can get to systemically low poverty if you live in a highly unionized state and you're a union member. Okay, and this is net of all those individual risk behaviors that we talked about earlier. So if you look at the upper, we have 4 different measures of poverty, but you can just look at the upper left panel to get a sense of this. You can see there's a big gap between non-union households and union households. So being a union member reduces your odds of poverty pretty substantially. But even for non-union households, as you move along the x-axis, the probability of poverty declines quite substantially. So you can get close to the average for rich democracies being in a non-union household if you live in a highly unionized state. So again, there is real potential for political forces and institutions in power to work both through social policy and in the labor market to result in lower levels of poverty. Now, to sum up, today I tried to argue that we really need to understand why the US has systemically high poverty as opposed to only studying the poor as a problem of persons. And I've tried to show that by fixing the poor or dramatizing the poor, these give us the wrong directions for thinking about poverty and much more for addressing poverty. I've argued that political theories are a better direction for poverty research. And moreover, as I mentioned at the very beginning, this is the first stab at trying to force myself to write a book as a commitment mechanism. And here, I just will briefly review some of the potential parts of what this book might look like, and we can discuss what's most important. First of all, I have a chapter where I'm trying to write about why cultural explanations pretty much are always going to remain a dead end for thinking about poverty. I want to write a chapter about the intergenerational quote unquote cycle of poverty, a chapter about dynamics and spells in poverty. Also write some work about the composition of poverty and talk about how the vast majority of the poor are working poor and how poverty is mostly a story of working poverty here in the United States. Some work on inequalities in poverty, meaning how poverty is patterned by race, sex, and the life cycle. And then of course, finally, several chapters exemplifying what I think is the best evidence for political theories of poverty. And I'll stop there. Thank you for your time and attention, and I'll turn it over to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Dave. We have gotten a few questions already during the talk. Ryan answered a few as they came in. There are a couple that I think I can kind of combine that would be interesting to hear your perspective on.
Okay.
And these are questions related to policy or laws. So
okay.
Aaron Jocelyn asked, what are the laws that lead to such high penalties for single mothers in America? Crystal Tiranowski asked about the relationship between state taxes and poverty percentages. Like, isn't there a pretty high correlation in the United States between high state tax rates and poverty percentages? So I think they're kind of getting at this question of like, what are the policy levers that exist out there?
All right. That's a great question. Let me take the second one first. I haven't seen evidence that states with higher poverty have higher taxes. It would be tricky to get at that very carefully. I'd have to think how that would look. So two dimensions. One, I haven't seen evidence that states with bigger governments or states are higher income taxes necessarily have high poverty. The reason California, which does have high income taxes, has high poverty with the supplemental poverty measure is because that corrects for housing costs and it's very sensitive to that issue. I don't think the supplemental poverty measure is a bad measure, but it's certainly not the only measure. And I think actually our understanding of state levels of poverty is still a little bit fuzzy at this point in time. So I haven't seen that evidence. On the issue of what policies or laws lead to America having such a high penalty for single motherhood, I think it's more an absence of policies. So for example, easy things the US could do would be to have a child benefit. Okay, so for example, in Germany, you have a kid, you get a check of nearly 200 euros a month for each child you have. No questions asked, it's not means tested, every kid results in that check. And the reason being the society has made a collective choice that children are a public good, they're a resource, and we're going to invest in children regardless of what the parents are doing. Now, the United States has nothing like a child benefit, and we're also one of the fewest countries that do. We have the earned income tax credit, we have the child tax credit, which moves us closer to that, but that misses some of the extreme poor and it doesn't do enough. And I'm a big fan of the ITC and the CTC. I would add to that one of the really exciting things that we're not talking enough about is how progressive the Democratic Party has become on this issue. I mean, they've really shifted the discussion and debate. And I point especially to our Senator Harris's LIFT Act, which would involve basically a cash benefit for children. So if we adopted those sorts of policies, like basically a child benefit as an entitlement for children, it would move the needle. I mean, it's very clear to me that if you adopted some of the policy proposals being considered by the Biden-Harris administration, you could really move the needle on this issue. And there's really terrific coverage of this issue by my favorite journalist, Dylan Matthews, who writes for Vox. And he had a beautiful piece recently where he goes through and sort of cost benefit analyzes, along with the folks at the Center for Poverty and Social Policy at Columbia, where they look at these Biden-Harris proposals. And I'm utterly convinced we could move the needle on child poverty if we chose to do so. So all of that to wrap back to your question to say, the answer is the absence of policies and laws. That's why we have such high child poverty. There's just a vacancy where other countries have policies.
Great, thanks, Dave. And I've got another couple that I think might make sense to combine in some sense. So one is asking about the relationship between prevalences and penalties. Okay. Is there evidence that indicates that a high penalty could discourage a high prevalence of a risk factor like single motherhood? Yeah. And second, just a kind of more basic descriptive question is that how might the composition of single motherhood differ across countries? Things like age, education, et cetera.
Yeah, age, education. Okay, so let me take each of those. So the first one about the prevalence penalty argument is something we talk a lot about in our 2017 American Journal of Sociology article. It's something we spend a lot of time talking about. And the logic is very straightforward, right? That maybe one reason that you get lower prevalences is you make the penalty very, very severe, right? So that's going to discourage people from being a high school dropout if you know that the relationship between being a high school dropout and poverty is very strong, right? That's a strong incentive to finish your education, okay? And we go through this and we look at each of the 4 risks and we demonstrate, and you can look at our evidence, that there's very little evidence that higher penalties result in lower prevalences. There's just very little evidence of this, okay? And even at a prima facie level, there's a bunch of countries that have high penalties and high prevalences, or low penalties and low prevalences. Countries differ across the spectrum quite tremendously, okay? So there isn't strong evidence. We talk a lot about this, though, what it would take to test this causally, but I think the prima facie evidence is the important thing, that lots of countries have been able to accomplish low prevalence with low penalties, okay? And yeah, so there's plenty of evidence that we talk about in 2017 AJS. Now, on the issue of like how countries differ in the composition, that's why one of the arguments we make in our paper is that when you estimate the penalties, they have to be conditional. They have to be conditional on all the standard predictors of poverty. So the penalty for single motherhood is the coefficient on single motherhood net of a wide variety of factors: age, education levels, the number of children, who else is living in the household. And so that estimate is actually conditional on those factors like age and education. And we can harvest those penalties, those coefficients, net of those factors. So net of composition.
All right, I'm trying to decide which super tough question I send you, because we could either go with a super hard theoretical abstract question or a more practical on the ground, what do we do now type of question.
I'll take the super hard theoretical abstract question. This has been a sort of a bird's eye view of poverty talk, big picture talk. It's not in the nitty gritty of addressing poverty. So I think that might be a better place for this question.
Okay, let me give you a couple of different theories that have been used to help understand or explain poverty's prevalence, and see if you have thoughts or if you're maybe going to include them in your book. Lately, we've certainly heard a lot more discussion of systemic racism in poverty policy in general. Michelle Coe asks whether you are going to think about systemic racism and how institutions work. And then the second one is in the behavioral economics literature. Yeah. There's this literature on scarcity. Have you thought about that? Do you see this literature arguing that the poor people's behavior needs fixing?
Okay, so on the first one on systemic racism, of course, it's very important, especially to the racial inequalities in poverty. So we could think of it 2 ways. Does systemic racism provide a good explanation for why there are such big racial inequalities within poverty? Of course, I think that's true. And there's lots of good work being done on this. I'm doing some work with Zach Parolin, Dedrick Williams, and Regina Baker on this very question. So definitely think it's the case that systemic racism helps us understand racial inequalities in poverty. But it's also interesting to think about if systemic racism helps us understand just the level of poverty, regardless of race. And I tend to think it does. I think of systemic racism as often operating through and causally prior to these processes, right? Systemic racism shapes the institutions we have, like mass incarceration. Systemic racism shapes the power dynamics within our society. We have weaker labor unions because of systemic racism. Systemic racism shapes the social policies we have. Our welfare system is arguably weaker because of systemic racism. So I think of it as sort of driving behind. It's causally prior to these more proximate processes that I'm highlighting in this figure. Now, you could also argue that systemic racism is sort of implicit in all of these factors. Regardless of what you do, I would argue systemic racism, if it fits in any one big theory of poverty, it's political theories of poverty. It doesn't fit in a behavioral theory of poverty. There's no way to sort of say to this big picture theory of poverty early in the talk that, you know, systemic racism somewhere fits in there. I don't see that as compatible with systemic racism. So if you think systemic racism is a big driver of poverty, I think we've got a better argument on the political side than the behavioral side to think about these issues. Now, that said, in this 2019 essay that I cite here, it's this annual review of sociology essay on theories of the causes of poverty. I talk a lot about this very issue. Okay. Now, on scarcity, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I do believe right here in this point about wear and tear, that poverty does feed back in, and I don't even have the mechanism drawn in, but you can imagine poverty feeds back into the wear and tear on the human body, okay? And it might cause present bias, cognitive burden, things like this. I don't think that's wrong. But the problem is it still has to work through behavior to be such a driving mechanism, right? And I don't think that this last part of this model is very convincing. I don't think this last part matters. So whatever causes incentives, culture, you could draw a box for like the human body over here. The theory is that it would wear and tear on you and lead to poverty increasing behavior. And if I don't find it convincing that behavior is the big driver of poverty, well, then that matters. Of course, I'm not unsympathetic to it, but I don't think that's the best explanation. More to the point is that I want to conjecture, and I've argued many times before, that most of our scarcities are problems of distribution. Most of our scarcities are problems of distribution. And framing it as a scarcity is a little politically disingenuous. So I'll come back to the example of like the homelessness problem here in the United States is to say, like, we want to say, oh, it's too expensive, or we don't have the resources to fight homelessness. So we totally have the resources to do it. Close down the pass-through income tax deduction. We'd be able to fix homelessness. So I think we present homelessness as a problem of scarcity. There's not enough beds in shelters. There's not enough mental health services. There's not enough social support services. We have plenty of resources to do this. We politically choose not to. So scarcity in some ways becomes a cloak that absolves us of failing to make the correct distributional choices.
All right, I've got a couple questions here that I think are kind of triangulating on something similar. Thinking about variation within the United States across states. And so one question is asking pretty directly about some of the work that you've done on declines of unionized jobs and rise of precarious work arrangements. That could be thought of as something that's a state level structural characteristic or a power resource. Also questions about the variation in things like prevalences and penalties across states. And then not exactly about states, but somebody's asking in terms of counties, but just kind of subnational laws, subnational policies. So basically thinking about poverty, prevalences, penalties across states and the kinds of political factors at subnational levels that could get some traction on this.
Yeah, good question. So I said earlier that I'm using this talk to pressure myself to write a book. Now I'm also going to use this talk to pressure my friends to write their books. Okay, so I don't want to, so they're not even here to defend themselves, but Jennifer Laird and Zach Parolin are trying to write a book called Poor State, Rich State that's all about this stuff, right? And so that's not my problem to answer that question. That's their problem. They need to write that book and so they can answer it for us, okay? That's my first move. Also, Adam Nicholson's here. He's writing a terrific dissertation on racial inequality and poverty using the prevalence and penalties framework, okay? And finally, Regina Baker, I think, is here as well. And she's done some of the best work about the biggest question within US state variation of poverty is why is the US South so much poorer? That's the big question. That's the elephant in the room nobody talks about. And I think all of those folks, all my friends, like in most topics, like in almost all topics, my friends are far smarter than I am. And that's one of my greatest skills as a scholar is I find smart friends. So those guys can all do that better than me. The one which I might have something coherent to say is about state level of unionization. And, you know, Tom and I are really working on this, and we have a paper that has an R&R on this very topic. And I'm just going to say I was working on this talk instead of working on this paper with Tom. But, you know, we provide some evidence that state level unionization above the individual, net of individual characteristics, also net of economic performance at the state level and at the state year level, we provide some evidence that state level unionization is the most important predictor of poverty. Okay, it's more important than business cycles. It's more important than the industrial structure at the state level. Of course, individual level stuff matters too. And state level stuff matters too, but we provide some evidence that state level unionization is the dominant predictor at the state level, okay? And that's partly because the Democratic Party is not terribly reliable the way leftist parties are in Europe in terms of producing poverty. And you don't see enough social policy variation across states. So the way in which states really vary is unionization, and that's the biggest driver of poverty differences.
Okay, we have time for one last question. We have a lot of questions remaining in the chat, but these are things that will be fodder for discussion maybe in our breakout groups. But given the focus in your talk on, or the number of ways that you just illustrated that the US is weird in a lot of ways compared to what should be our comparable peer nations, and that the fixes such as they are might be political, are we too weird to ever fix, or is there hope for generating policy that's less stingy, less focused on individual behaviors, and maybe more effective at reducing poverty?
Great question. So I've tried to argue, despite the sort of somber tone of the topic and my criticism of some literature, I actually am very optimistic about our ability to fix poverty. I think it's extremely tractable. I don't think we have scarcities that prevent us from addressing poverty. I just think we don't have the politics. So I'm actually quite optimistic that we could address it. I would also point to the work Marianne Bittler's sitting right there, and her work has been genuinely inspiring to me about things like SNAP and the ITC. These are highly successful policies, right? They work, they're very effective. And I think one of the troubles of dramatizing the poor is we downplay these effective policies, and it fuels that sense of intractability and hopelessness to poverty. And I understand why we do it. I mean, we want to create moral outrage. We want to inspire people. We want them to feel offended by poverty. But I've never had a shortage of outrage about poverty. I think we need more understanding of what works and what's effective. So I'm actually quite optimistic. So I don't think we're too weird to fix it. I do think that a lot of the policies we've put in place the last several decades have been really effective. The expansion of SNAP has helped millions of children, right? What we need to do is just expand it further to childless households, to expand it further to children in immigrant households. That's how we can attack poverty. I think the ITC is a wonderful social policy. I think that the Affordable Care Act was a tremendous social policy accomplishment. I am more, I will fight anybody on Obama and fighting poverty, and that I think the ACA was the most important social policy for poor people in my lifetime. And it's remarkable to me how we downplay and trivialize this. It removed tens of millions of people off the uninsured rolls. And I don't think President Obama gets anywhere near enough credit for what that did to reduce poverty. So I would look to all these social policy successes, and we just need more of it. And by always dramatizing the worst cases, we sort of downplay how effective these policies are. Now, beyond that, I would say that, I don't know, I've said enough about that. That's what I would say. I'm optimistic. I think that we have social policies that do work. They've been proven to work, and we just need more of them. And we should focus on that as our way to think about poverty. And I'll stop rambling there.
Okay. I think, so we're going to try this. First of all, we take our mutes off for a minute and thank David. This is really awesome.
Thanks.
Really, really stimulating. Thank you so much for taking the time.